Hey guys, it's Patricia. Welcome back to the Bad Chinese Teacher Podcast. This is episode 18, which is the Ask Me Anything episode. This was actually supposed to come out last week, but the questions that I got, first of all, there were many, and second of all, they were all very good. And so I realized, coming off of the tails of the Model Congress trip I was on with my kids over the last weekend, I just really needed a little more time to kind of think some of these through. But anyway, thank you to all of you who sent in questions and for making me think so hard, because these are generally really good questions, and I'm really glad I get to spend an hour kind of picking them apart. The topics of these questions range from obviously things about learning Chinese, me teaching Chinese, also some stuff about being Asian, being Chinese American, being Taiwanese American in particular, things about dealing with, like China, Taiwan politics and dealing with those kind of conversations. And so you can kind of see why I needed the extra week, but thank you to everyone who sent in these questions. I'm actually really flattered that like I have enough people listening to this to even post an episode like this. I think whenever you see like these Ask Me Anything, Reddit, whether it's like a Reddit post or like a podcast thing, I think there is this kind of like weird supposition that you would only ask an expert anything, right? Like you'd have to be like somewhat compelling as a person and have some sort of like tangible expertise in order for anyone to take your responses seriously, which makes this all the more hilarious because I have no credentials and no expertise, and yet people still find it compelling to ask me questions. So my only conclusion to that is like, you all must be asking me these not necessarily because you're interested in my expert opinion, because I have no expert opinion, but because like these are probably things that you're thinking of yourself. You probably have answers to these on your own, which is totally cool, and you just want to know how someone else, this random person on the internet, thinks about them. And I think that's a really cool dynamic. And so I hope that as we're going through this episode, these questions, that you're kind of thinking about it from that posture, right? I have my kind of thoughts on these, based off of my experiences and point of view in life, but also I hope you are also formulating your own thoughts and your own views to some of these questions, because I think really many of you who are listening to this, taking a look at my listener demographics, I think a lot of you probably would have really, really interesting and valuable things to say about all these topics as well. So I'd love to hear about them too. So feel free to reach out via social media in response to this episode and to let me know what your thoughts are on some of these. So, but anyway, let's jump into some of these questions because there's a lot of them and we only have an hour. So, got this on Facebook from Sabrina, who says, "Hi Patricia, I recently found your podcast and love it so far. Thank you. I just finished episode 4, the Andrew Yang one. RIP, his campaign. Anyway, the reason why I messaged you is because I am a heritage speaker who's trying to learn Chinese in her final semester of college. I was supposed to study abroad this semester at Jiao Tong University in Shanghai, but it got canceled because of the coronavirus. I know that you mentioned that your time in Taiwan was extremely helpful in learning Chinese. So I was wondering if you had any tips for me to improve Chinese without being in China. I'm taking beginner Chinese now at my school." So, thanks, Sabrina. First of all, kudos for starting a language in your senior year of college. I feel like most people who I know who did that were either trying to fulfill a language requirement at the very last minute, because the college I went to had like a pretty substantial language requirement in order to graduate, no matter what major you were. Or B, you're someone who's just genuinely like, it's your senior year and you're electively choosing to study a language, and an East Asian language at that. And East Asian language departments at colleges are kind of notorious across the board for being like kind of tough and like not holding back on the work. So for you to like take your senior semester to do that, kudos all the way. And it also probably means that you are majoring in something not Chinese related and probably something like, useful, unlike what I majored in, as much as I love my major. So again, kudos to that. So give yourself a lot of credit. For those of you who are taking Chinese in your college classes as kind of like purely an elective, purely for quote unquote fun, although I'm sure that it does not feel like fun a lot of the time, give yourself some credit, because it's actually a pretty big burden to take on, and most people who are in your position are taking it with some greater goal in mind, and it's kind of like a smaller part of a bigger picture that they're like willingly suffering through in order to like achieve that larger goal. And so for you to like just take it for fun, I'm just like, that's pretty cool. So yes, Sabrina, you're right. So I mentioned this probably within the first 4 episodes. Now I'm forgetting which one it was, but I learned most of my Chinese at a summer study abroad program in Taiwan. For those of you familiar, this was the ICLP program at National Taiwan University. I highly recommend it. It's very good. It's very expensive, so get your school to pay for it. Don't pay for it yourself. But it's a very good program, and I would really attribute the bulk of my Chinese knowledge to that program. I think a lot of people would say the same. It was a good program. Being in Taiwan definitely helped, but I think it was more kind of like the program rather than being physically in Taiwan. The reason why I say that is because we had like a language contract while we were in the ICLP building. So it's kind of like you literally had to speak only Chinese while you were in that specific physical building under like duress, right? If you're caught speaking English more than like, I don't know, maybe like twice, they like threaten to kick you out. So it was like, I don't think this is uncommon. I feel like a lot of like language institutes have this sort of like pledge, like Middlebury, I'm sure has like a pretty strict sort of language pledge sort of thing. But what that results in is that like you become kind of language starved after you leave classes. And so you just speak English everywhere else, despite the fact that you are literally in like a Chinese speaking country. I mean, you want to be able to socialize and be like, talk like a normal person to your classmates without having for it to be, through the filter of what you learned in class that day. So I would not overstate the benefit of physically being in a place. I think it really has more to do with what program you are enrolled in, if you're in a language program at all, as well as how much active energy you are taking in order to really learn the language if you are taking lessons or classes for it, That being said, I'm not really sure, Sabrina, whether or not your program is at Jiao Tong University was going to be a language learning program, language study program, or if it was just kind of like regular study abroad where you would be taking regular content area classes just in English at that university. I think that would be two very, very different experiences. And so I'm not really sure what that context is. But nevertheless, your question is about being able to improve your Chinese while not physically being in a Chinese-speaking country, to which I'd say, well, yeah, I'd hope that would be possible because as far as I know, none of my students are like studying Chinese in China. Most of them, all of them except for like maybe 1 or 2 have actually been to China before. So yeah, no, it is totally possible to study a language and study it well without having to do it in that specific country. And if you are in that specific country, your success really is not guaranteed. It really is about what you do rather than just like, collecting or absorbing the language by osmosis. So don't overstate the benefit of that. What study abroad does do, though, is expose you to the culture and life of that language, and that will serve as a motivator for you wanting to learn the language more. And I would apply this to, if not even more so, to heritage speakers, because I think we have like this emotional connection to the quote unquote homeland that, per my experience, oftentimes gets like awakened once you spend significant time abroad, especially if you're spending that significant time without family members. If you're there alone and you're giving yourself space to process. I've seen that happen with a bunch of friends as well as myself. So I think the benefit of being in China to learn Chinese has little to do with like the language acquisition component of it, as much as it has to do with like kind of the emotional experiences you have while being in the country, experiencing those different things and the culture and the people, and just having the time to kind of like, especially again as a heritage speaker, as an Asian American, to kind of work that personal journey out for yourself. So what I'd say is like, hey, once the coronavirus thing like dies down a little more, it's still worth it to like spend some time if you're invested in if not learning Chinese, then connecting with your heritage, spending some time as an adult alone, traveling to the country of your parents, the country of your ancestry. I think it was very, very important for me to kind of understand who I was and to kind of, figure out where my life was headed. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing without having spent significant time in Taiwan, not necessarily learning language, but learning the culture and connecting with people. So feel free to take that time, even without the benefit of having a study abroad program, because I think it'll make a big difference. But that being said, on the topic of motivation, so, right, like, one thing I think I have to state with heritage speakers is that like learning our heritage language can oftentimes be a very like emotionally and cognitively, very challenging thing. Because there's a lot more emotional baggage that comes with learning our parents' mother tongue than it would be for some random non-Chinese person to be learning a language just for funsies. And so wanting to keep up with your language, like your heritage language, requires motivation. And I think staying motivated will actually be the most important part of your success in learning a language, and creating a language learning environment that is conducive to that, to you staying motivated, will be the most important thing. And so to answer your question about ways to improve your Chinese without being in China, I would say number one, no matter what you pursue, no matter what books or techniques or whatever you pursue, find a way that will keep you engaged. Do not come at language learning as I used to have this perspective, and I actually used to impress this view on my students, and I realized, and it backfired tremendously, which is how I know not to do it anymore. But whatever you choose, whatever methods you choose to learn Chinese with, it is so important to find methods and techniques and materials that will keep you engaged consistently. Why? Because the moment you start disengaging, the moment you start getting bored or tired, or you think it's too hard, or you like feel like you're suffering way too much for way too little, you will not want to learn anymore, and that will actually be the main reason why you don't become fluent. Like it's much harder than you think to keep up motivation for learning a second language. Because again, if you're an English speaker and you exist on this planet, chances are you could probably survive as a monolingual person and not suffer any ill effects from that. Like your quality of life will not depreciate because you are not bilingual. And so to be bilingual, then, even if you are a heritage speaker with this like massive cultural and emotional baggage about like being not fluent in your parents' native language, even without that, there is very little reason for you to go to such great lengths to become bilingual. And so you really need to give yourself reason to do so. And one real good motivator for keeping this up is to make language acquisition as easy as possible for yourself. And I use the term easy with like heavy air quotes because I think that's a very subjective term. What I mean by that really is like if you find yourself exerting effort for the sake of like, just suffering with and telling yourself that like, oh, this will pay off in the future. For instance, just a very, practical example. If you find yourself copying characters over and over and over and over again so you can like learn how to write certain characters by hand and you're miserable, you should stop doing that because you will only become more miserable, and the more miserable you are, the less you will want to learn. If you are, as you're taking your Chinese classes, obviously there, one of the motivators behind, you taking a Chinese class is that fact that you'll be graded. So, that's as legitimate a motivator as anything. But absent of that, if you find yourself trying to study Chinese in a way that is kind of making you unhappy, be very, very cognizant of that because it will only make you more unhappy unless you start seeing tangible results, which is difficult, especially since, in my opinion, a lot of the things that are kind of boring and suffering inducing when it comes to learning Chinese are oftentimes positively correlated with like ineffectiveness. I personally am not super convinced that being able to write lots and lots of characters by hand will really improve your proficiency in Chinese, but that's a topic for another day. So practical advice wise, for me, what I've discovered as being the most painless and yet most effective way of learning a language is through comprehensible input. Now, if that phrase sounds familiar to you, it's because you probably listened to my TPRS episodes, as well as my conversation with Rachel Casella, who is also a comprehensible input CI for short teacher, who uses those methods. And basically, in a nutshell, comprehensible input, the theory behind that is kind of like, if you give a student enough literally like comprehensible input. So basically like, written and spoken materials that are at level for what they can understand. If you give them enough of that comprehensible input, and don't necessarily force them to output stuff right away, they will be able to learn things like vocabulary and grammar and sentence patterns and all of that very, very organically. This is in contrast to like giving a kid a vocabulary list and then giving a kid a bunch of grammar rules and saying like, go put these together into a cogent sentence. The former method feels very like abstract and kind of woo-woo and kind of like, because it's kind of like the Rosetta Stone sort of like philosophy, which I am still very much a skeptic of, because I feel like people kind of overstate it without really knowing what they're doing. But the idea is kind of like, hey, this is how we kind of learn language as children. We picked up on words that we heard mom and dad say over and over and over again, and we associated meaning with those words. And so that's how we learned words in English, right? Or our native language. And so theoretically, you are able to learn a second language in a very similar way. Not the exact same way, because like, you could say stuff about like brain plasticity or whatever, but we do have the capability of recognizing when things are high frequency, when the same words keep popping up over and over and over again, and they are contextualized with something else that gives us information as to its meaning, right? And so if you have that repetitive input that you understand, you will then be able to adopt that new information as your own, and then eventually be able to use it yourself. So in a practical sense, for a lot of people, that ends up being like watching a lot of TV. Which is tricky in the sense that like TV oftentimes can introduce a lot of new vocabulary all at once. But the benefit to TV is that like humans, when they speak, regardless of the language, tend to be kind of repetitive and use like, the same words over and over and over again. Particularly if it is like focused in a certain subject area, right? If you listen to the first 15 minutes of this podcast episode alone, you'll notice that I've probably only used the same handful of words over and over and over again. And so if you're an English learner listening to this podcast, you'll probably be picking up words from my podcast that I keep using over and over again, and then you'll adopt that for yourself, and then you'll also adopt some of like the language, the sentence patterns that I use when I speak. And this is the reason why that like if you learn a language from a certain, like if you study a language with only one teacher, and that teacher has a very distinctive way of speaking, you will probably start speaking that language just like your teacher, right? Great example of this is that my students have only had me as a Chinese teacher, and so they've started picking up on my kind of like Chinese kind of quirky isms when I speak. Like my students just started saying like 对啊, things like very Taiwanese Mandarin, stuff that I never taught them, but they'll just say 对啊, like kind of that sort of thing, because they hear me speak it, right? I didn't have to teach that to them. This is a very like inconsequential example, but what that is proof the fact that like you can learn a lot of vocabulary. You can even learn a lot of grammar just from hearing stuff that, again, you understand. The comprehensible part is quite important to this. The reason being is that like once you start hearing stuff that you don't understand, your brain just kind of shuts off. And so you want to avoid that happening. So my advice to you is to find things that build into that comprehensible input approach. Watch a lot of TV. As a heritage speaker, you'll have a leg up on this because you won't necessarily you'll have more like listening capability in terms of Chinese. And so you probably won't be as confused, and you'll probably be able to like, really zero in on fewer words rather than having to like, you know what I mean? And so watch a lot of TV. I have rarely seen someone who speaks Chinese very, very well without having watched some amount of TV and movies. I don't know. That just seems to be the common thread. Or English, for that matter. Chander, who I interviewed a couple of episodes ago, his English is basically flawless, and it's because he watched a lot of Disney Channel, right? And so TV seems to be kind of like the key to a lot of this. But be intentional when watching TV. This doesn't mean like you need to be, super meticulous and keep a running notebook of like vocabulary terms when you watch TV. I used to do that, and then it actually like disincentivized me from wanting to watch TV ever, because I got so bored and frustrated with having to take notes while I watched TV. So I just stopped. And then you realize your brain actually will still do the work of like retaining those new words as long as they are repeated enough in that show. And so like things of that nature, right? So that's what I'd say. In terms of reading and writing, which I think a lot of like heritage speakers kind of angst on about, I think if you're starting from zero, which you probably aren't if you're taking classes already, but if you're starting from like zero or close to zero and you just need somewhere to start because you're looking at like a mass of Chinese text and you have no idea how to read any of them, the fastest way to kind of maintain, like get a foundation is to like grab the official vocabulary list for the HSK1, the HSK2, and the HSK3, make flashcards and just memorize those. After you've memorized those, you'll probably know enough characters to be able to pick up like a graded reader or some short, simple novel written for Chinese learners, and to be able to read that. And reading those novels will help you with your reading abilities more than any sort of just memorizing vocabulary list. Why? Because novels are interesting. vocabulary lists are very not interesting, or even like short dialogues, which apparently the bread and butter of a lot of like traditional Chinese textbooks is like kind of each chapter opens up with like some sort of dialogue of two characters talking to each other, like, gets dry and boring and kind of hokey. So novels, short novels that are, again, comprehensible are the best way to keep yourself engaged in learning that new vocabulary. But you do need kind of like a base for understanding some of those novels. So if you're, again, an adult, I wouldn't suggest this to my like students, because my students are some of them are just so impatient and unwilling to, like give them a vocabulary list and they would kind of balk at it. And so I don't use this approach with them because they need a little more help. But if you're an adult learner and you're cool with like just memorizing a bunch of stuff just, to get that over with, just take the vocabulary list from the HSK 1, 2, 3, 4 if you just really love flashcards. And then you'll have enough of a base to like grab a graded reader or a simple novel and read that. And when I made my like graded reader, these are basically just novels that are kind of written again for Chinese language learners and are constructed in a way, the sentences are constructed in a way that will help you learn. A really good resource for those graded readers is Mandarin Companion. By the way, they also have a really great podcast called You Can Learn Chinese, which I highly recommend. It's very good. But their reading materials are excellent. And so you look at the novels and be like, oh, this is so hokey. And like, I can see like so many like native speaker teachers look at that and be like, oh man, this is too easy or whatever. And like, no, whatever, screw that. So like the reason why they're good is because like, again, they're written with the purpose of you learning language. And as such, the way that they present the text will be comprehensible, and they will help drill in the vocabulary through repetition. And so, and it's still relatively entertaining. It's not necessarily just dry vocabulary lists. So it's really kind of a delicate balance. I had mentioned before, like, the whole, like, learning language as if you're a baby, or like the Rosetta Stone, whatever. It's not as if what I'm saying is like if you just kind of fire hose yourself with tons of like Chinese language, you'll magically become fluent, right? It's the same reason why I'm saying, just because you live in a country for a long time doesn't necessarily mean you'll magically become fluent by osmosis. But the alternative to that isn't necessarily you exerting a ton of effort and suffering in order to like just kind of pointlessly memorize a bunch of rules and vocabulary words and then, be left on your own to kind of put the two together. That actually will, not only is that really boring and will probably demotivate you, but it's not the most efficient way to learn a language. And so comprehensive input, look into that if you haven't already. I am convinced that this is the best way to learn a language. If you want to sound like a natural native speaker, if you want to like have good tones, if that's something you're concerned about, comprehensive input would do that for you. If you want your grammar to sound like an actual human rather than, just something out of a textbook where you just kind of like, or if you're like my students who have the temptation of like taking vocabulary that they know and just kind of like, those like fridge magnets that like have words on it that's kind of like, found poetry where like you have like fridge magnets with like the words on them and you just like rearrange them into sentences that are like, oddly poetic but also don't make a lot of grammatical sense. I found that my students used to do that a lot because they were just given words and then like no real models from which to kind of like construct sentences out of, but they had kind of like general grammar rules. And what would come out is like stuff that was either grammatically incorrect or stuff that sounded very, very unnatural. And so we want to avoid doing that. And so the way that you avoid doing that is, again, looking at being able to learn your language and contextualizing its meaning. And so anyway, that's a very long answer to your very short question, Sabrina, but thank you for asking it. But yeah, being in China does not necessarily guarantee you anything, and there are plenty of ways to learn a language that is not suffering inducing while also being effective. And so anyway, thank you. All right, let's move on to something a little different. This is not a question, but I appreciate the sentiment. The question was literally coronavirus and how we can or should combat anti-Chinese sentiment. Big topic, so big that I did an episode on this, exactly this topic a couple of weeks ago, but, about coronavirus. And I think in that episode, when I was looking at, so for context, that episode was basically me taking a look at kind of like tweets about coronavirus and its relationship to racism. The context of this, of course, being that like because coronavirus originated in China, the kind of worldwide panic and paranoia concerning coronavirus has people kind of taking the connection between coronavirus and China and then kind of projecting their fears onto Chinese people in ways that are pretty racist, and so for lack of a better term. And so, yes, for the bulk of this question, you can look at that episode and probably address a lot of that. But I want to kind of talk about the term, two things that are interesting about how this was worded. So number one, they said how we can / should combat anti-Chinese sentiment, as if there were kind of like an option to not combat anti-Chinese sentiment, which I think actually is a valid discussion. And the second interesting thing is the term itself. It's the term anti-Chinese sentiment, which I think is actually pretty loaded. So I'll talk about both of those things. The first, let's start with the anti-Chinese sentiment part first, because I think a lot of people's like xenophobic fears about China as a concept, even outside of the whole coronavirus thing, a lot of it actually has to do with politics rather than race. And so I think one thing that is really important for people to understand, Chinese people included, is that race and government are not the same thing, or ethnicity and government are not the same thing. The Chinese ethnic group, like Chinese people, and the Chinese government, the PRC government, are not the same thing. I think a lot of folks, Chinese people, non-Chinese people, make the mistake of associating the Chinese people with the Chinese government. And to an extent, I would even, to say something somewhat politically controversial, I think that the Chinese government, the PRC government, actually also does intentionally kind of connect politics with ethnic identity, which is an interesting and very powerful political strategy if you think about it. But all that aside, I think if you're talking about quote-unquote anti-Chinese sentiment, I think it is very legitimate to have anti-Chinese government sentiment, just like you could have anti-insert country here government sentiment, because governments are, they have an agenda and they're not perfect and they tend to do bad things sometimes, right? Like, governments are subject to fault by virtue of their own actions. I'll put it that way. This is different from taking an entire ethnic group and saying this entire ethnic group is collectively responsible for doing bad things, right? Or this entire ethnic group has a certain agenda. Those are two very, very disparate things, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that. So when we talk about anti-Chinese sentiment, I think, number one, let's separate anti-Chinese government sentiment versus anti-Chinese people sentiment. I think the desire to want to conflate government with people is just a result of lazy thinking, in the sense that we kind of associate people groups with states, and we should really not do that. So, that being said, the reality, though, is that, like, regardless of what the PRC government does, or really any government, right, people, as a result of their lazy thinking, will take the actions of a government and then tie it with the people. And the result of that is something that Chinese people in flesh and bone have to deal with that on a daily basis, like it or not. I'm guessing the person who asked this is a Chinese person or ethnically Chinese person, and so they're asking how ethnically Chinese people, can and or should combat anti-Chinese sentiment. And again, the interesting thing about that can/should is kind of like, is it even our responsibility to, as we're living our lives, to like be at this war against anti-Chinese sentiment? To which I'd say, no, live your life, right? No, just because you're Chinese does not give you an obligation to kind of defend your entire people group against, racists. I think if you have the energy in you to combat that in your daily life, whether it's someone making an offhand remark to you or to someone else, if you have the energy to combat that, by all means, right? But no one should feel obligated to kind of take extra energy out of their day in order to undo the work of racists. Now you could say, if we all did that, would the world be a better place? Well, probably yes, but also we'd also be a lot more tired and probably a lot more bitter. And I think that's something that's really important to remember with like social justice work. social justice work is really should be seen as something obligatory, especially if it's coming from the oppressed party, right? It is not the job of the oppressed to kind of undo social injustice against them. And in fact, doing that work is far more taxing for the oppressed person than it is for someone of privilege to do that work as someone who is sitting, who has that privilege, right? Which leads me to my next point in the sense that, like, if this is someone who is not a Chinese person and you're asking how we can/should combat anti-Chinese sentiment, I think if you are a person of privilege, you are not Chinese, and you are looking at the racism that is happening against Chinese people as a result of the coronavirus, I think as someone who enjoys that privilege, you do have a responsibility to, at the very least, talk to the people around you, people who like will take you seriously about the racist things that they're saying. These are all hypotheticals, but the reason why I say that, why I say that people of privilege do have that responsibility is really simple. In that, like, okay, let's use this as a scenario, right? Say I have say you're my friend, right? You're white, and you're my friend, and your I don't know, sibling says something offhandedly anti-Chinese, racist, coronavirus, whatever, and I'm in the room. It doesn't necessarily have to be aimed at me, but knowing that I'm an ethnically Chinese person, and then your sibling says something just kind of off color or whatever. If I were to address that, whatever I say will always carry the weight of the fact that, like, I am myself Chinese, or ethnically Chinese, and therefore whatever I say, people will view through that lens. And it will not seem like an impartial lens. It'll kind of be like, oh, you're just offended because you're like, cute little Chinese sensibilities are getting all worked up, right? Like, or like, oh, you're just biased because you have family in China. I don't. But like, you have family, you're personally invested, you're not impartial, right? So why are you trying to impede on my freedom of speech, right? So for me to call that out, right, is not only less effective, but also it forces me to put my identity on trial while I am trying to defend or trying to combat this, quote unquote anti-Chinese sentiment. For you, my friend, my white friend, to be the one to speak up instead of me, it puts you at much less risk, which sounds strange because, like, well, this is my brother or this is my sibling, whatever, and so I am putting that relationship at risk. Well, yeah, but at the same time, right, we're talking in terms of, like, efficacy and, how well a message is going to be conveyed. You being a white person, being able to communicate this thing, you will sound a lot more impartial than me. There is something inherently wrong with this in the sense that, like, why is a white person's word on this topic being held to a higher, level of respect than what I have to say? This isn't the only place where this is applicable. This is literally applicable in, like, basically any circumstance regarding race, in the sense that, like, whenever someone like me talks about race, it always comes across as being like, I have the chip on my shoulder because I have, personal experience or whatever. Whereas when a white person talks about race, they come across as being impartial. We could be saying the exact same things, and yield totally different results. I've experienced so much of this firsthand. It's not even funny. And so, I think this depends on the question asker's background, about the whole can/should. If you are Chinese and you find yourself exhausted by having to constantly defend yourself amongst people who are making off-color jokes about, coronavirus and how you are contagious by virtue of the fact that you are Chinese, you should not have to be expected to expend extra energy on combating anti-Chinese, racism, on top of all the stuff that you are dealing with already. However, if you are not Chinese and you see this happening around you, know that Chinese people are not in a place to really defend themselves, right? And so in that case, if not them, then who, right? So that's the kind of the can/should, but the question was how, to which I have not offered any sort of useful advice. How should people combat anti-Chinese sentiment? I think if you're a Chinese person, again, how you combat anti-Chinese sentiment is by protecting yourself, is by building resilience. I think in this day and age, unless, again, you're someone who finds yourself strong enough to be able to kind of get in these verbal spats with people and call them out on their racism or their off-color remarks, I think if you're not that strong, which I certainly am not, the best thing you can do is to learn resilience, and to be in the good company of others who are like you and who can support you, because it's really tough to have constantly people like you and people who you love being treated like pariahs because of something they can't control. And so to combat racism enacted against you is to build up resilience through community. That's kind of the best advice I can give you, because I think that's really like the most universal advice. And I think that is also, if you're someone who's willing to be out there, if you're Chinese and you're willing to be out there and you're willing to get in those like messy Facebook discussions and whatever flame wars about racism, again, all the more power to you. But I think even then, the prerequisite is being able to protect yourself first, and to be resilient and to have a place to come back to, a community to come back to where you will be supported, because I think it's really hard to do this kind of work otherwise. So if you are not Chinese and you are combating anti-Chinese sentiment that is inflicted upon people who you care about and love, who are ethnically Chinese, what I'd say is speak up, please. Again, like I said, because no one else will. And the thing that changes people's views, people are a lot more malleable ideologically than you would think. And honestly, most humans are just willing to go along with what the culture and the society around them has deemed acceptable, right? And so if it is culturally and socially acceptable for people to make off-color jokes about Asian people and coronavirus, then people will play along, whether or not they have racist tendencies, within them or not. If someone makes it okay, if the people around them, if the internet, if whatever, if they've been given signals that making these comments and jokes is okay, then they will go along and make it with them, and it'll exacerbate the problem. So the way you undo this is to make it culturally and socially not okay. And the way that you do that is by calling things out. And so this is, again, as someone who works with teenagers all day long, where social pressure, peer pressure is such a thing, right? And it's so easy to go along with stuff that is very much not okay. And it's very difficult to be the one to say, hey, that's not okay. I think it matters a lot to be able to step up and just say, oh, that's not cool. Oh, that's not, are you really going to say that? There are ways to say this. And I think in this day and age, people are not going to be it is not uncool to call things out as uncool anymore. It is not uncool to be empathetic. And I think you should give people the benefit of the doubt that if you tell them oh, that's, really? If you call people out, people will listen. And so give that a shot, I'd say. Don't be afraid to speak up, because people are depending on you for that. So anyway, for things that are specific to coronavirus in particular, episode 16 is what you're looking for. I did a whole episode on that. All right. This was a good one. This one was from my friend Chander. Hi, Chander. He says, thank you for being so vulnerable and openly honest. The podcast does help me reflect on certain things in my own context. Is there a particular reason behind your word choice Chinese, as in Chinese teacher, teaching Chinese as opposed to Mandarin? Or what are your thoughts on these two terms? A semi-sociolinguistic question, just out of curiosity. Thanks. Great question, actually. Because I think you could actually make a very valid argument that my constant use of the word Chinese rather than Mandarin is actually quite problematic and inaccurate. So as a kind of a refresher, the difference between the term Chinese, or the difference between Chinese and Mandarin linguistically is really quite simple. Chinese is a family of dialects. There are many dialects of Chinese. Most of them not mutually intelligible, but the one thing that they do have in common is that they generally shared the same written script. So for instance, if you are a speaker of one Chinese dialect and you meet another speaker of another Chinese dialect and you can't understand each other when you talk to each other because your dialects are so disparate, you could in theory write a letter to that person, write down what you say, and then that person could read what you wrote and you'd be able to understand each other then. So that's kind of one of the coolest things about Chinese, is that kind of the diversity in the spoken language and then the common link in the written language. The That being said, Chinese is this big, big umbrella. Mandarin just happens to be one of the dialects. The reason why the two are equated with each other is because when like the Chinese government was like, we need to pick one of these dialects to be the official one, because like otherwise this would be like Tower of Babel level sort of chaos. Mandarin just happened to be the dialect of, you know, the basically the capital at the time, right? Beijing was the capital that they just took. That's a dialect they spoke. Okay, that's the official dialect. There are other reasons for that actually stretch back historically far more, but I don't want to go into that. But on a very basic level, the reason why Mandarin is kind of like the dialect for Chinese is mostly for political reasons, political expediency reasons more particularly. And so as a result, the term Chinese and the term Mandarin tend to be equated with each other, mostly for practical reasons, because usually when people are say Chinese, the particular dialect they are referring to is Mandarin. And so it's kind of like this act of like, you know, linguistic expediency. But it does tend to be a little problematic, because by saying that, you know, Mandarin, you know, Chinese then equals Mandarin, it effectively erases the bajillion other dialects there are out there, because those are just as much Chinese as Mandarin. It just so happens that Mandarin just got really lucky in like certain place, certain time, when we decided that Mandarin was just going to be the dialect. And so for me, why do I choose the word Chinese? Why do I call myself a Chinese teacher rather than a Mandarin teacher? Well, really, I go both ways. I think the most accurate sort of job title for me is Mandarin Chinese teacher, like, because then it acknowledges both the Chinese part of it as well as the fact that it's the Mandarin dialect that we're teaching. But really, the reason why I emphasize the Chinese part is really like a practical consideration for myself. It was mostly because, and I'm not even kidding with this, it was because I had people telling me, how do I write this in Mandarin? Which is like a sentence that is so logically incorrect that I just couldn't stand it anymore. Because at least at the very least, if you say, how do you write this in Chinese and how do you say this in Chinese, that would actually make, you know, logical sense. You can't write in Mandarin. You can't write in a dialect. Dialects are purely spoken languages. And so I had, at the time when I was teaching, I was like teaching kindergarten as well. And so like kindergarten is not really an age where you could really effectively describe the differences between like, you know, language families and dialects and have it mean anything. And so in an effort to get people to stop saying things like, I'm writing this in Mandarin, which is just flat out wrong, I just cut my losses and said, let's just call this Chinese for now. And then once the kids get into the older grades, then we can spend time talking about the linguistic sort of complexities behind it. So that is actually my rationale for how I named this podcast and how I refer to things in the professional sphere. But yes, to be very, very fair, this podcast could very well be called the Bad Mandarin Teacher, because I don't teach any other dialects other than Mandarin, because I don't know any other dialects other than Mandarin. My Taiwanese is terrible, and my Cantonese is, I grew up amongst a lot of Cantonese speaking people, and I don't speak any Cantonese, which is embarrassing. But yeah, but really it is a symptom of a larger phenomena. When you're kind of creating things that are, you know, when you're creating marketing things and titles and names of courses and whatever that are outward facing, and your audience is someone who does not necessarily understand the nuances of Chinese language, culture, whatever, only because you haven't been exposed to it, you end up having to cut your losses a lot and being like, let's just go with what is socially most well known right now, and then once they're in the circle, like once they've gotten started learning, then we'll talk about we'll zero in on accuracy then. And so yes, I am well aware of the distinction between the two. I am also very well aware of why it is problematic to constantly refer to Chinese as when I really mean Mandarin. But really, I think this points to kind of a larger ignorance of how the Chinese language is perceived. There's actually generally just a lot of ignorance about how Chinese learning works. In part because Chinese is just such a trendy language nowadays, and people just think it's another thing to kind of just jump on. And because also Chinese culture tends to be so like exoticized and mystifying, people tend to kind of like look at it as this kind of like mystical black box and like not really understand or be willing to understand the actual reality behind it and the nuance behind it. And so, really what we're doing here when we constantly refer to Mandarin as Chinese, it really is in a sense capitulating to a lot of ignorance that happens to surround the Chinese teaching sphere. And we are, we're kind of forced to do so, if only because it would be so impractical and to kind of like go into the details right away. And honestly, at the end of the day, no one would really care as much as we do about it. And so the solution to this is to kind of bring as many people into the circle as possible, to not have that kind of purity test, that kind of gatekeeping between, you can only really enter this space if you like respect the nuances between Mandarin versus Chinese as a concept. Invite as many people in as possible, maybe sometimes under like somewhat, inaccurate, faulty pretexts, and then correct them while they're here, when they're invested, because it really is a lot to explain. I just literally spent 10 minutes talking about this. So that's my answer, Chander. I know as a fellow language nerd, I care about this probably as much as you do, but at the same time, I've come face to face with a lot of the reality of how people perceive Chinese, and a lot of nuance just isn't there in the general, amongst general audiences, and you kind of have to work with that. So, speaking of languages, how would you explain to someone with no prior understanding how the Taiwanese language, Taiwanese dialect, is not the same thing as Mandarin? Also, do you often think about what the future of the Taiwanese language is, and if it can successfully develop its own stance? The reason why I asked is because my sister, who is Taiwanese American, was recently asked in the workplace if she could comprehend Minnan. But admitting that she could comprehend the quote-unquote Chinese dialect of Minnan kind of thwarts the idea of there being a Taiwanese language, referred to as quote-unquote Taiwanese, which is really just an offshoot of Fujianese or Minnan language, which is technically originates from like southeastern China, where Fujian province is. But at the same time, like Taiwanese language, if you're talking about languages spoke on Taiwan, you would also have to include like indigenous language as well as Hakka in there. So not exactly sure, but I'm assuming that like Taiwanese language here you're referring to as Minanhua or Taiyu. To which I would just, my distinction to that is if I were talking to an audience that was actually interested, I just say that those are two different dialects, and Chinese has many, many dialects. Taiwanese is one dialect, Mandarin is another dialect. You want to talk about why Mandarin is more prominent than Taiwanese, that's a larger political discussion. But it really just depends on how interested the person is, because again, it goes back to my previous point about nuance and how like the popular understanding of Chinese just really, really lacks nuance. And so, to explain it to someone, I think, again, really depends on their level of interest. Because I think once someone is actually interested, I think if you explain it, the full political and historical ramifications of all of that, I think they'd have a lot to gain. But it just really depends on how interested they are, right? But if you're talking to someone who's just superficially interested, it's two different dialects, right? That's really all it is. Second question I think is a little more interesting. How do you often think about the future of Taiwanese language and if it can successfully develop its own stance? So I suppose what this is asking is like the fact that like Mandarin, I guess this is mostly talking about in Taiwan, maybe. The idea that Mandarin is so centered in Taiwan, in the, just in daily life, in the professional sphere, in politics, whatever. And then Taiwanese, Taiyu, is kind of been, like marginalized, which is, if you know a little bit about Taiwanese history, this was not the case until, several decades ago when the KMT came to Taiwan. Before then, Mandarin was not spoken in Taiwan much at all. Before like 1949, Mandarin was not widely spoken. It was either Taiyu or Taiwanese or Japanese. So for my grandparents who were born in Taiwan before the KMT came, their first language was actually Japanese, and then Taiwanese, and then Mandarin was their third language. And so the idea that Mandarin is so centered in Taiwanese life now has a lot of historical and political ramifications, and the fact that Taiwanese as a dialect has become so marginalized, again, political and historical ramifications. For me personally, do I often think about what the future of Taiwanese language is? Not often, but only because I don't speak Taiwanese. I think that actually has a very big bearing as to how I answer this question, because my family on both sides is, again, both sides of the family have been on Taiwan, been in Taiwan before the KMT came to Taiwan. So that would make our family what we call 本省人, as opposed to 外省人, which are the Han Chinese people who came to Taiwan after the 1949 occupation. And so, the people who are from who have my family background usually are Taiwanese dominant families, which is true for my family that it is in Taiwan, but it is not true for my brother and me, and it is also not as true for my two cousins who were also raised in the States. And so I don't think about it often because I did not learn Taiwanese growing up. My parents spoke to us in Mandarin. I don't really know why that is. I think it's because like my parents, for both of them, they also grew up in Taiwan when Mandarin was really, really being pushed, and Taiwanese was really, really kind of seen as not taboo, but like just not okay to be speaking out in the open. It was kind of a weird political time. Martial law kind of does that to you. And so as a result, both my parents were educated in a very Mandarin-centered educational system, but they spoke Taiwanese to their grandparents because their grandparents only understood Taiwanese. And so in the sense, it's like Taiwanese was their heritage language and Mandarin was their like native language, if you want to frame it in those terms. So as a result, my parents passed on their native language to me as that became my heritage language, and then their heritage language just kind of disappeared, which really kind of says a little bit also something interesting about how Asian Americans will then pass on their heritage language to their kids. Because it's funny because like a lot of the childhood songs that I grew up with were Taiwanese songs, but I never learned Taiwanese. So maybe Asian Americans will pass on, I don't know, Chinese folk songs to their kids, but their kids will never learn Chinese, which is kind of depressing. Anyway, this is not answering your question at all. The latter part of the question about Asker's sister was recently asked in the workplace if she could comprehend Minnan. Minnan being like, again, the broader linguistic name for the family of languages that Taiwanese is a part of. So Minnanhua and Taiyu technically are basically synonymous, but the difference, and I think the question alludes to that, is that people on mainland China also speak Minnanhua, particularly people in Fujian. And to be fair, people also in like Singapore speak Minahua as well. The diaspora kind of spreads the dialect around. And so like, I guess what they're saying is that like, you know, by saying that like she spoke Minnan, it kind of links it up more with like the mainland Chinese side of things because it technically is also a mainland Chinese dialect rather than it being a distinctive Taiwanese thing. Like I said, this is the reason why this question this AMA is not really kind of like, here is this expert with expert opinions. I think this is a really interesting question to think about because really what this is pointing towards is, the ties between a language and an identity, right? Taiwanese, Taiyu is so heavily linked with like Taiwanese identity, even in the sense that like Taiwanese independence movements claim Taiwanese as kind of the language of the independence movement and Mandarin as being a colonial language because it kind of was. But then you have to deal with the reality that like Taiwanese people do not have a monopoly on this dialect because it's spoken in a bunch of other places as well. I think it really just comes down to the context. I think this is one of those things where you can see language, like it's difficult to have hard cultural identifiers for certain identities. I think the greatest example, the most obvious example of this, is Taiwanese Americans' association with the ROC flag. Because to be honest, like a lot of Taiwanese Americans are very involved in Taiwanese politics. That's a topic for another time, the complex like relationship with that. But you see a lot of like Taiwanese American kids really identify with and take pride in the ROC flag without really understanding kind of, again, the political ramifications behind the ROC flag. And that like the ROC flag is kind of like, the ROC stands for Republic of China. And so the flag that we commonly now associate as being the quote unquote Taiwanese flag is actually the flag that was used before, again, the KMT came to Taiwan. It was the flag that was recognized in the United Nations as the flag of China before the PRC was a thing. And so without knowing that political context, a lot of Taiwanese American folks see the Taiwanese flag, the ROC flag, and see that purely as kind of a symbol of their own ethnic, national identity, whatever, right? Without knowing exactly how complex it is. And I think you could really apply that to a whole host of things. But again, right, like, it just depends on how deep you want to dig. I think a lot of times, like, your personal identifiers, your cultural identifiers end up being like a matter of like what you feel in your gut a lot of the times, right? And so, I think a lot of Taiwanese people feel their affinity with Taiyu in their gut because it's what they grew up with. It's what they, associate with family. It's what they associate with, for some people, their church, because the Taiwanese Presbyterian Church has a very big, plays a big role politically in Taiwan as well, things of that nature. And so, it really comes down to, it's really hard to say to someone like, oh, but by the way, this language is not just your own language when people have such close ties. It's just because also, you could draw the same parallel between Taiwanese American kids who grew up in America and have no idea behind the political ramifications of the ROC flag and yet still feel an affinity to it because of what they saw or experienced growing up. Maybe they had one in their house or something. I don't know. So this, again, not a great answer from me, but I think it really kind of shows you the complexities behind that. All right, let's take another look. Okay, this one is kind of, I'm looking at, we're kind of short on time. I think this one would be a good one to end off on. But do you have thoughts on how to talk about certain topics with a partner from the mainland? They, being the partner, they grew up here, but they have some interesting viewpoints about things like whether Taiwan should be its own country, the protests in Hong Kong, and the treatment of Muslims in China. I just feel so Western when I talk to them about these. I feel like I'm seeing up-close people from the mainland feel really loyal and patriotic about China, to the point where when I brought up the Muslims topic, he said it was a Western lie. Answering this question cautiously, because I feel like, again, if you're a Chinese teacher, I feel like I've already overstepped many, many lines that I'm not supposed to overstep with regards to Chinese politics and my career. But I also think that, like I said in the episode about social justice where I talked about this a lot, I think if you're an educator, and your priority is with your students, I think you'd be really foolish to think that your students, if you're a Chinese teacher, your students wouldn't know and or wouldn't care about these issues. In fact, I would say that if you're a Chinese teacher who is interested in keeping your students engaged in caring about the reasons why they should learn Chinese, politics is always going to be a part of it, because again, you can only really compel students to care about, China through the lens of food and culture and holidays to a certain extent. I think politics will always and social issues will always have a hand in this, and you need to be well equipped to answer them. And so that's kind of like my not well-formed reason for not really shying away from these political topics, because I think they're important. I think, if you want to speak Chinese, right, you need to understand Chinese people in order to stay invested in your reasons for wanting to learn. But that being said, man, this is a big question, and I'm going to try very, very hard not to shoot myself in the foot through answering this. But for one, I think I heavily empathize with a situation like this, because I think both sides of any of these arguments are incredibly passionate, and people who take a certain stance on any of these topics feel very, very strongly about them. Now, whether or not that stance is well grounded or not is another matter, and I think that really kind of comes down to how you're getting your information and what personal affiliation you have with each side. There's a lot of it's really easy to take all of this really personally, because I think to a certain extent all of the things that you're stating here, the Taiwan thing, the Hong Kong thing, the thing in Xinjiang, a lot of the argument that surrounds it really comes down to, well, I identify as this, and therefore I need to stand up for people like me. And I think that perhaps is also what this person is dealing with regards to their partner. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to like I said, identify what exactly the highly personal nature behind each of these, right? Every single person who's coming into, and I include myself in this equation as well, every single person who's coming into any of these topics is coming from it and who cares to a certain amount of it. And I'll rephrase. I'll say this. If you are a Taiwanese, Hong Kong, or Uyghur or mainland Chinese person engaging in any of these discussions, your opinion on this will, at least in part, be informed by who you are. I think it'd be really, really hard to look at any of these issues objectively. And so as such, right, I think if you are any of those groups, you cannot say that you are impartial. But that doesn't mean that your opinion is invalid. It just means that you're empathetic to certain people who are suffering a certain plight. And I think being able to, in the context of your relationship with your partner, I think it's really important to kind of look at it from that point of view, that like no one here is objective. But that doesn't mean that your opinions don't matter. It just means that you have to recognize the biases that you have, as well as the special empathy that you have for a certain kind of side, and why that empathy exists, and whether or not that empathy, where empathy turns into bias, if you know what I mean. And so, yeah, I mean, I empathize fully. I think I don't know whether it's because like I've intentionally sort of surrounded myself with I have way more young Taiwanese friends than I do friends from the mainland, and so I feel like I myself kind of tend to live in a bit of an echo chamber, with regards to with all of these issues, and I fully acknowledge that. But at the same time, you know, me personally, doesn't make me any less invested in my stance in all of these. For me personally, I feel like a lot of my own stance and the way that I defend myself is, you know, through not only my lens as a person of Taiwanese heritage, but also as an American who believes a lot in democracy and freedom of speech, and things of that nature. My so-called Western indoctrination, which I think a lot of people would probably claim once they hear my point of view, to which I would say, you know what? Fair. Like, I'm not, you know, I was educated in the US, and so therefore no one should be surprised that I reflect some of those views. But like, I think it's interesting that you say that you feel very Western when you talk about issues like these, as if, again, I'm assuming that, again, like your partner is someone who espouses kind of like, you know, who espouses these, and I'm assuming like anti-Taiwanese independence, anti-Hong Kong protest, you know, Muslim stuff, in bad way of phrasing any of this, but you know, under the idea that he or they have to maintain this point of view because this is the side that supports Chinese people, and the opposing side is anti-Chinese, right? This is a very, very big topic. This dynamic is very, very complicated, very difficult to unpack, but I think if I were to kind of gloss over it in the most sort of cursory way possible, because I'm coming short on time, I'm realizing, is that, again, it goes back to ethnicities are not governments are not ethnicities, governments are not ethnic identities, and so I think it's really important to say that, like, just because you are a certain ethnicity does not mean that your identity is tied to the actions of a certain political body, nor is the opposite true. So anyway, I think, oh man, like I said, guys, these questions that I received like 1 to 2 weeks ago are so good. Like, y'all should be running this podcast instead of me, because y'all are clearly smarter and way more thoughtful. But thank you for allowing me the privilege to answer some of your questions. I did not get to even half of them as I'm looking at these. I really thought that I'd be able to kind of, you know, cover all of these. But unfortunately, here we are at 1 hour and 2 minutes in, and we still have so many more to go. So I'll probably save some of these for another day, maybe for the next season, which again is, you know, the season is coming up to a close. We're now on episode 18, so episode 20 is the finale that will be long awaited at this point. I personally can't believe that I've been doing this for like 20 weeks. That's, you know, again, yeah, thank you for sticking along for the ride, guys. And thank you for listening to my heart and my ramblings and these disorganized thoughts, and being willing to engage as well. This has been really fun to kind of see your questions, and to also see your DMs. If you have further questions, I routinely answer DMs on basically anything. So send them over. You know, again, they'll probably be far more well organized than what I'm saying here, because I'll have more time to think about it. But like, really grateful for all of you for staying on board, for listening, and for joining me on this journey. It's been really, really fun. And so as we come close to the end of the season, been just really thinking about the future of this podcast, what we want to achieve in season 2, as well as what you guys want to hear as well. So to let me know all of that, what you can do is you can leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. Just scroll down to the bottom if you're using Apple Podcasts, the app, or even if you're not. Scroll down to the bottom, leave a 5-star review, and write me a little something to let me know how I'm doing. You can also connect with me on social media. On Instagram, this podcast can be found at Bad Chinese Teacher, on Instagram at Bad Chinese Pod, and on Facebook, just search up the name of the podcast. If you are looking for me, Patricia, you can find me on Instagram too, at Patricia Liu, on Twitter at Patricia SQ Liu, and you can find my latest writing at my blog at blog.patricialiu.net. Show notes for this episode, as well as all past episodes, can be found on the podcast website, which is badchineseteacher.com, so check everything out there. New episodes are posted at 8 a.m. every Monday, and so I will see you next week. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.